You are seeing my
Yes,
slide.
we see your slides perfectly. Yes.
All right, so we're ready to rock and roll?
Ready to rock and roll.
All right. Thank you all very much for being here this morning. I want to extend appreciation, especially to Patrick and to the organizers of the conference for making this possible. In all honesty, I wish I could be there with you. You should know that in the US, the work that you do in Sweden, especially around family support and support for young children, is highly admired. And I think the work that you're planning and initiating with respect to PALS is going to be a perfect fit with many of the strengths and many of the directions that you're already going. My hope is to take the first hour or so and really focus on the core features and the effects that we have seen with PALS, and to make sure that we leave 20 to 30 minutes for discussion about how we can make that fit with what you see as being the critical variables affecting your schools. So in terms of moving forward, let me start with both some assumptions and some basic goals that we want to achieve. The first assumption that I've got is that many of you actually are fairly experienced with the features of PALS or PBIS. You've been to or been part of the work that's been done in Norway or Denmark. Some of you we know have actually been part of work that we've been doing in the United States. So I want to acknowledge that several of you actually have a fair amount of knowledge already. But my understanding from conversations with Patrick especially are that a fair number of those of you coming to this conference are fairly new to the ideas behind PALS. You understand that it's a behavior support framework, but this is a little bit of a new idea. And I should say, I distinctly appreciate that you're allowing me to do this in English. And I have to acknowledge that were you to do a similar presentation in the United States, not many of my colleagues would be able to follow your Swedish. So I am in great admiration and appreciation that you're willing and able to let us do this in English. I'm sure that the elements that need to be translated will be. The third assumption is that we all share a basic common commitment to not just the academic success for children, but the social emotional, their personal success. And that we're going to come back over and over again to the way in which PALS is set up to ensure that you reach all children, not just those who are most privileged and most capable of moving forward. I also want to acknowledge that in any of the efforts we make to build a learning community, it's got to start by honoring and appreciating the unique experiences that each person brings. PALS is an approach or a framework that we have used, but I want to emphasize over and over again, it is not a one-size-fits-all approach, but rather a set of strategies that we found to work in a wide array of different situations. So I'll come back to that as we move forward. Here are the basic goals. The basic goals for the next 90 minutes are that you will leave with a good understanding of what I'm calling the core features of PALS. So we're not going to get into all of the nuances and all of the things around the edges or a host of specific strategies. But I want you to have a sense of, if you were to walk into a school that was using PALS, what would it look like? What would it feel like? If you were a teacher, if you were an administrator, or if you were a student or a parent, if you were to walk into a school, what would be the critical things that would be there? And I want you to test and examine the extent to which those features are things you already see and which ones you would need to add. My hope is that many of the things that I'm calling core features of PALS are already part of what you are using in your schools. The other is I want to link those core features with social and emotional well-being of children. And part of what I want to come back to over and over again is this is not just a set of ideas that people have. It's actually an approach that has been systematically tested in an array of research efforts, not just in the United States, but in other parts of the world. So I want to come back to sort of why we do this and what happens, what are the real outcomes we get from kids. It's going to be important to me that when we leave, we have time for questions so that you're able to really pose the concerns or the issues that would be drivers that would say, how do we make this whole approach fit with the schools and the communities and the families within Sweden? So basic assumptions, fairly simple set of goals. And let's start this by sort of walking through fundamental pieces, directions, and things that we've learned in the United States. So the first thing, one of the big issues for me is really coming back to why are we doing this? And this is not about an academic approach. It's not about a theory. The fundamental purpose of PALS is to make schools more effective, more efficient, more equitable learning environments for all children. And it is critical to understand that unlike some manualized versions of approaches to behavior support, we don't view this as something that's a locked-in process. We're very open to adjustments and additions. If you've got a strategy that is better, that is easier, that is cheaper, that is more efficient to do, we're ready. We're ready to go forward. So the fundamental purpose of doing this, the reason why even this early in the morning, I would like to see a little bit of heart rate increase from you as you look at this, a little bit of excitement, is because you're looking at this and saying, I'm not as interested in learning about PALS, but I am very interested in learning how to make our school a more effective, efficient, and equitable learning environment. Here's what we basically have learned. If you are already implementing an effective curriculum with unambiguous and clear instruction, you're looking at saying, how can we create the social culture that makes that learning more efficient, more effective? Here's what we've learned about social cultures that support good learning. First and foremost, they're excruciatingly predictable. The students can predict what we are going to do. The teachers can predict what each other are going to do. So if you want to make a good learning environment, one of the first things that I'm going to argue is make it an environment that is very, very clear. And it is surprising that we as adults often think of our schools as very obvious, very clear, very transparent, and yet the students are very unclear. So part of what I'm looking for, students in schools that work well using PALS, identify an environment where it is highly predictable, what's expected. It's also consistent across people. So there's not one set of expectations for person A, another for person B, another for person C. Students are able to say, this is going to happen across people, across places, and across time. So within the school, we're creating a community, and we're creating a community that is very accessible and very predictable. It's also positive. So one of the features of positive behavior support, one of the features of PALS is that you will find students being acknowledged much more often for doing things correctly than they are corrected for doing things incorrectly. The focus is on being preemptive and positive. So I want you to be thinking about how proactively we're going to teach what we expect, we're going to acknowledge what we expect, and we're going to be clear and consistent in what we expect. The fourth key variable, if you're going to create a school that really works well, make it predictable, consistent, and positive, but also make it a place where the students feel safe. They feel safe physically and they feel safe emotionally. And doing that involves a more consistent approach than simply telling students that they're safe. It means creating an environment where we as adults repeatedly and consistently do what we say we're going to do. So everything I'm going to talk about in the next hour is about how to make schools more effective, efficient, and equitable. The key features that you're going to be looking for are the things that we're talking about, things that make schools predictable, consistent, positive, and safe. The goal really is to establish what I'm going to call a positive social culture, a culture in which the students are very, very aware of what's being expected. They identify not only what the teachers expect from them, but also they build this sense of expecting appropriate behavior from each other. And you really are going to have achieved success within this approach when you not only have something where the students feel they are doing what the teachers have expected of them, but where they actually are embracing that and expecting those things from each other. In many ways, what we see with PALS is a combination of basic values with good behavioral science. So I want to argue over and over again that this approach starts not as a technology, not as some sort of artificial structure, but as something that is based on core values that you as teachers, administrators, school psychologists, counselors, and the school community come together around. What are the core themes that you think are going to make your school a unique and powerful environment? Integrity, honesty, empathy, commitment. Oftentimes, we talk about building schools where students are respected and they extend respect to others. We expect students to be responsible for their own behavior. And a feature that is growing in the schools that I work with in the United States is a focus on kindness. Reach out to others, include others in things you're doing. Be thoughtful and thankful for comments and support you get from the people around you. Building schools that have those core values, not just demanded, but actually taught and supported, makes a difference. The other things that we're looking for is if you combine those values with science, you actually get an effect. So the science that we're looking for are the practices and the systems that are necessary to make schools more effective. I'll come back and go through what those look like and how we argue for defining how we get both academic and social success and how we assess within schools if it's actually working. Now, part of what we've learned is if we're going to actually build effective learning environments, the four elements that we keep coming back to over and over again are these. The first is a real focus on outcomes. So I want you to be looking at your school and asking yourself, to what extent are we clear about the extent to which we're building social competence as well as building academic achievement? So are the students building the social skills? Are they building the interaction competence that's going to make them more capable of being effective citizens? The other piece that we really focus on are the core practices that support student behavior. And we oftentimes present this in the context of this symbol of the integrated triangles. And part of what we've learned is if you're going to be successful at supporting student behavior in an entire school, using the whole school as the unit that you're looking at, you're going to need to use not just one approach, but you're going to need a layered approach in which you have some things that you do for all students. Say, look at the big green part of the triangle, all students. But there are going to be additional things that are necessary for students who need a little bit more support, just as you would do if you were teaching math or reading. Some students get the content immediately. Others need a little extra support or a little additional practice or coming at the idea from a different perspective. That's what the yellow part of the triangle focuses on. And then we recognize that there will always be a small number, typically 5 to 7% in the research that we've done, of who are students who really come with significant needs, either through disability or through trauma or through experiences that they've had prior to school, where they come with a sense of real distrust with the educational community. With those students, you're going to need individualized behavioral and social and emotional supports. So part of what we've learned is the practices within PALS are not a simple thing that you do basically the same with everybody all the time. There are a set of practices for assisting students to behave well that are layered and adapted to the needs of the students. There's also a set of strategies, and those of you who are administrators or actual teachers in schools, I really want you to appreciate this. Part of what we've learned is never implement practices without the organizational systems that are necessary for those practices to be successful. Think about the effects of having good policies, priorities, team systems, having the time for teams to meet and to make decisions that move things forward, having the data, both the academic data and the social emotional data necessary to make good decisions. One of the characteristics of PALS is that we never implement practices without also implementing the organizational systems that'll make those practices possible. A key part of that keeps coming back to the use of information or data. And I would argue that within the United States, one of the biggest changes that we've seen when we help schools adopt PBIS is that they become much more effective at collecting and using information to tailor and adjust what they're doing to be successful. If we do that well, we build schools, like I said before, that don't just work for those kids who are smart and privileged and come from highly supportive environments. It works with equity. It works across all students so that we're able to adjust to the needs that those students have. Okay, so if we get a little bit more detailed, remember I promised you I wanted to focus on the core features. So I'm trying to gradually build the layers that will give you a good idea of what would this really look like if you were to do it in your school. So if someone were to say, what is PALS? What is PBIS? It's not a package, it's not a program, it's not a strategy, it's a framework. It's a framework for establishing both the school-wide social culture and the targeted behavioral interventions and supports that are necessary for a school to achieve behavioral and academic success for all students. Now, the things that we've learned that are the key pieces that we keep coming back to are these. You will succeed with PALS if you adopt these kinds of messages. First and foremost, I want you to think about PALS as a way not to correct problem behavior, but in many ways, a strategy for preventing problem behavior or the dangerous and difficult behaviors that impede both the social and academic success of students. So PALS, first and foremost, is about prevention. We don't wait for children to fail and then correct them. Rather, what we want to do is right the very first day from school starting, we want to come in and say, here's how you're going to be successful. These are the ways that you succeed. Part of that is defining and teaching a small number of core social expectations. So these are going to be the values that I talked about. And I want you to be thinking about these. What are the expectations you have for students in your school? And to what extent are those really clear? So defining and teaching expectations, acknowledging those. You never teach something that you don't acknowledge on a regular basis. But we also arrange consequences for behaviors that are contraindicated, behaviors that are problematic, behaviors that are dangerous and difficult. When students are behaving in ways that are not acceptable, the key, though, is we use consequences that redirect back to the positive behaviors we've taught. We don't think of consequences as a set of punishers. We think of consequences as teaching tools. We want to use instructional corrections, not punitive corrections. I'll come back to that when we talk a little bit more. Schools that implement PALS also are going to collect and use data for decision-making. And I want you to question, be careful. I was trained as a teacher, and I taught in a special education environment for a long time. And most of what I learned was that I needed to take care of my own classroom. PBS, PALS, is basically a way in which we say your classroom is critical but insufficient. If we do PALS well, we're talking about the whole school. And that means we need to collect information about how students are interacting on the playground, in the cafeteria, in the hallway, in addition to what happens in the classroom. The idea of a continuum of supports where there's not just one trick, but there are strategies that we layer. So we make sure that students get the level of support that is going to be most important to them. And then this whole idea of implementing the systems that actually make things work. Now, I want to come back a little bit to this whole notion of social culture. I mean, it's a nice sounding term, but if we were operationalize that, what does it really mean? What does it mean to build a social culture? At a very simplistic level, I want to argue that you have been successful at helping a student become part of a social culture when you create a group of students who have a common language, not all speaking Swedish, but they're all able to tell you about what are the expected behaviors. We keep coming back to identify not 38, not 40, not a large number. Think of 3, 4, 5 key values that you want to be clear, that are the guiding values of your schools. I mean, what are the variables that you want to be understood by families, understood by students, understood by the staff? So a common set of a common language, something like be respectful, be responsible, be safe, something that concrete and simple. But here's what we've learned. Giving students a common language is insufficient. You also need to give an experience that they've had. So this whole notion of teaching the behavioral expectations in schools that use PALS, every year at the beginning of the year, there is a half a day or a day, depending on the age level and developmental level of the students, where there's review, teaching, and development of the behavioral expectations. There is a common experience. So here's what I want you to get. If we do this well, students not only know themselves what the expectations are, but they know that everyone else also knows the expectations. You've created a social culture when you've created a context in which success is clear and what's expected is not only been taught, but it's something that everybody embraces. So common language, common vision for how this is going to work, and a common experience in which I know that everyone has been taught. You have been successful at building a social culture when you build a sense of a common language to achieve a common, safe, predictable, consistent, positive environment. And the students have gone through an experience together that they're able to use. So think about this. Think about your own school. If you were to walk into school tomorrow and you were to ask students, stop 2 or 3 or 4 students and say, do you know the expectations here? What would they say? And we do this on a regular basis, and we ask the question differently for students in 10th and 11th grade than we do for students in 2nd and 3rd grade. For the 2nd graders, we might say, tell me what the 3 B's are: the be respectful, be responsible, be safe. In high school, we'd say, tell us what the school expectations are that we all are embracing. So can the students tell you what the expectations are? But here's what I really like. If you've built the vision, they don't just learn a word. Anybody can say be respectful, but they actually know what it means. So what I typically do is I say, well, what does that look like right here? So if being respectful and being responsible are what we want in this school, tell me what being responsible looks like in the hallway. Tell me what being respectful looks like on the playground or in the classroom. If students can tell you what the behaviors are, then they actually know what's going on. The last question I always ask is, has anyone acknowledged you for doing things right? Have people acknowledged you for doing these things in the past 2 weeks? And in schools that implement PALS in the United States, when I ask these questions, 80% of the students can tell me the expectations, tell me what it means, and can identify that they've been acknowledged for doing things right in the past 2 weeks. Some do it in a more offhanded way, others are very clear. But if you've built a social culture in which students are very confident, very comfortable, very safe, a social culture that's going to lead to academic success, the students in your schools will be able to answer these kinds of questions. So just a quick reflection. And we typically do this in groups rather than in one-on-one. But I'd like you to be thinking, if you were to ask these questions of your students, what would they say? And think about that. Actually write down what you think they would say. And then tomorrow or the next day, stop 5 different students, ask the question, and you're going to get an answers. And you've been doing PALS well when you ask kids the questions and they can answer these things. Now, when we started doing this, a major force, a major vision for us was work done by George Sugai. George is a professor at the University of Connecticut. He was at the University of Oregon for about 18 years, and we worked very closely together. But George had some insights that were really helpful to us. One was the message I've been trying to give over and over again, which is that the social culture of a school matters if you're going to achieve academic success. So for those who are saying, look, all this sounds well, but I'm really interested in math, reading, writing, and science, part of what we've learned is you will get better academic outcomes if you create a social culture that is predictable, consistent, positive, and safe. The second thing, and this was one of the hardest ones for us, is we were all trained as teachers, and we were all trained to work, primarily in our own fiefdoms, our own classrooms. What we really learned is if you build a social culture, you build a learning community that extends to the whole school. So that requires a level of collaboration, a level of thinking, a level of organization that's a little bit different than we typically do. The other thing that George taught us was this whole notion of focusing on the systems rather than just on individual tricks. When we first started doing behavior support in schools and classrooms, we taught teachers about pre-correction. We taught teachers about using acknowledgement and using prompts and using strategies for assisting the development of self-managed behavior. But we did not get large impact until we shifted to implementing those practices, but with good systems. We also kept coming back over and over again to, it's easy to do things for one student, but when you have 1,500 students in a school, or you have 400 students in a school, you need to be thinking about layered approaches that make implementation of the social culture not just possible, but highly efficient. This needs to be something that normal people can actually do. So we came up with this whole notion of multi-tiered systems. And if you read about PALS or PBIS, you will see this notion of the layered triangle show up in many different ways. The early intervention people have made it a little more fuzzy. The academic people shifted it into a three-dimensional form. The people in Maryland actually decided that they wanted to turn it upside down. All of that is fine. In fact, if you don't like triangles, you can use concentric circles. The point is build behavior support so that you do preventive, foundational support for all students. A big message, I want you to think about doing behavioral support with every student, even those who walk in behaving well. That's the green part of the triangle. Only when you do that well can you then add the portions, the yellow and red portions that make things work. So the big messages we've learned: invest in prevention first, right from the beginning, teach and support what you want. If you do that, everything else you do that responds to problems that arise is going to be easier and faster. Establish multiple tiers and invest early when you see problems occurring. So look at what you do initially, but add the other elements to make it go. Now, one thing I'm worried about, all right, I don't want you to think about the multi-tiered system as being a diagnostic process. We ran into problems in the United States with teachers talking about students as being a kid in the green side, or a yellow kid, or a red kid. We don't find that language useful. I want you to think about a student and think about the multiple tiers as levels of support, not a diagnostic process for his students. So if you look at this one student, he might be needing normal tier 1 support for reading. He might need a little bit more detailed support for behavior. He may need highly individualized support for math, but in terms of health and well-being behaviors, he does just fine. So it would be inappropriate to label him a green kid, a yellow kid, or a red kid. He is a student who gets different levels of support depending on what his needs are. So this whole notion of school-wide multi-tiered supports is a really important one for going forward. All right, so I promised you that I would really try and focus on this whole notion of core features. So let me take just about 3 or 4 or 5 minutes and go through what I think are the real core features of PBIS. Everything starts with fundamental values. So what are the values you have for your school related to social, emotional, and academic success? What are the core features of the school that will lead to those outcomes? And then what are effective practices that you can use? So one of the examples, we've learned that creating an environment that is highly predictable is a core feature. We've also learned that teaching the behavioral expectations is a practice that increases predictability. So that would be an example of an effective practice that builds a core feature that leads to outcomes. But one of the things that's been fascinating is to learn the different ways that people in different environments or different schools find for teaching the same core features. We've learned to focus on values, to think about the core features as the science. What are the critical features of effective learning environments? And then to think of the practices, the way you do it, as the technology. Be firm, right, across school, across time, about the values and the science. Don't change what we talk about as being core features and values. Those are things that you hold dear. But be very flexible about the practices. Make the practices fit the developmental level of the students, the social emotional context, the preferences of the families. If you do this well, you'll create, you'll be able to do PALS in a way that almost seems like it meshes naturally with what your school typically does. The three dangers that we see over and over again is thinking that the practices are where you start. Don't start with practices, start with your values. If you know what you really want and you measure that on a regular basis, you can create schools that are incredibly effective. The other is pretending that the technology or the practices are really the science. Don't get too caught up with the strategy that you're using to teach expectations or build consequences. Use what works well for your school. The critical thing is, have you actually built that core feature? Don't assume that there's only one way to do it. There's always many, many different ways. Okay, so if you were to walk into a school, right, here we go. If you were to walk in and say, we're just looking at the tier one, the very first part of PALS, what does the school look like that has the social emotional foundation that really works? What would you see in your school? The first thing you'd be able to see is a leadership team that is monitoring what's going forward, that is leading the staff in the development of the system. The second thing that you'd see is a set of school-wide expectations. So all the faculty, all the staff, all the students, and most of the families would be able to tell you a small set, 3 to 5, typically no more than 5. It's got to be something you can remember. It needs to be developmentally a match with the students. Once we get into grades 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, we always include the students in selecting what those behavioral expectations are. But if you were to ask the students, what are the expectations, they can tell you. You'll also find something where on a regular basis, the students are acknowledged for doing things correctly. And this doesn't mean overdoing it. This doesn't mean giving away large assemblies every day. This is a system of small, short, easy ways in which adults in the building not only acknowledge each other, but they acknowledge the students. Build a system where the students are regularly acknowledged for doing things well, and use acknowledgments not just to increase the likelihood that somebody does something, but increase the precision with which they do it. One of the things we've learned, don't acknowledge the student, acknowledge the behavior. So rather than saying, Elise, that was wonderful, you did a great job, tell her what she did that was a great job. So she's clear about the behavior. In this setting, what you did really made a difference. Consequences. One of the biggest differences between schools that use PALS and schools that don't is that too often in schools that are more traditional in the United States, consequences are simply punishments for doing things wrong. In the schools that we are working with most consistently, consequences are viewed as part of instruction. So if a student is behaving inappropriately and you have defined and taught already what you want, the consequence becomes stop, don't do that. Label the behavior, interrupt, redirect to the appropriate behavior. If this is what you want to do, this is the way you do it. Bring the kid back to doing it the right way. So in part, interruption and redirection are used over and over again. But the critical one is the fourth one up there. Make sure that problem behavior is not inadvertently rewarded by faculty or by other students. If you withdraw the rewards for inappropriate behavior while you're simultaneously teaching what you want, you get significant change in kid behavior. We also really focus on classrooms. A big issue in terms of looking at how classrooms operate is to focus on how we build routines within the class. So I want you to think in your class, what are the core routines that the students need to do well? How do they transition from the classroom to the cafeteria? How do they move from independent seat work to working in groups? How do you as a teacher get the attention of students right at the beginning of the day or after a break? Teach those routines. Don't tell, actually practice them. Teachers that do PALS well in the classroom systems that we work with have high rates of praise, and they preempt problem behavior by actively teaching the routines that are the critical ones for their classroom. We use data, and I'm going to come back to this because if you're using PALS, you should always be able to look at data that answers two questions. Question number one, are we doing what we said we would do? Are we actually doing PALS? Are we doing the core features? Question number two, is it benefiting students? You should, as a teacher, as an administrator, as a member of the learning community, on a regular basis, and we typically think of a regular basis as monthly, be able to identify how are we doing with respect to implementing the things that we said we would do. Now, another piece that we've learned is really focusing on the behavior of students to each other. If students acknowledge and reward deviant and dangerous behavior in their peers, what we do oftentimes really doesn't work very well. You all in Sweden have really focused often on issues related to bullying. Well, this is a great example because bullying behavior is almost consistently maintained by the reaction that students get from other students. So part of what we do is we don't just teach students what is expected from themselves, but we teach them how to respond if another student behaves inappropriately. How do you handle her inappropriate behavior? And we don't just say it, we actually have in class practices where we say, if someone is rude and inappropriate, what do you do? How do you get help? How do you behave in a way that minimizes the likelihood that that problem behavior will be rewarded? The last key feature, the last core feature of Tier 1 in PBIS is family engagement. We have learned you never educate children without active collaboration and inclusion of the family. So as I said before, we acknowledge the success that you all have had in family support. We view family collaboration as one of the critical features of effective behavioral supports. All right. I promised that one of the things that I would do was to walk through core features, but I also want to give you a little bit of background of what we've been doing in the United States to give some foundation. So part of what we have been operating is we've been doing PBIS for about 20 years. And within the United States, there are currently over 30,000 schools that are actively engaged in implementing these features. Not all of them are doing it perfectly. Some of them are early on. We have been immensely struggling with how to keep this going in the face of the pandemic and the breakdown of both social and school systems. But it's been encouraging. We are rebuilding and reintegrating and restarting our schools this fall. And so far, we've been encouraged at the role of school-wide behavior support as a way to reinvigorate and launch schools. We have PBS being operated in all 50 US states. There are about 97,000 schools in the United States. So we're working with about a third of all the schools and over 15 million students. So part of what we're looking for is this is not something that we're just doing in one place or in a little spot. We're doing it across the cultural variation of high urban environments, rural environments, the northern and southern parts of the states. And we've learned that if we do PBIS or PALS well, it's something that has to be adjusted to the local culture. And we've learned a lot about adapting to local cultures by also working with colleagues and friends in other countries. So PBIS is currently being implemented in more or less intensity in over 21 different countries. So this is not something that we've just started. We've been doing this for about 20 years. Other schools have been demonstrating that they can actually pull this off. And in terms of the research, I mean, part of what I would always encourage you to do is to say, if this sounds like it might be something we'd be interested in, is there any systematic research saying that this really works? And the answer is yes. There is a host of about 30 major research studies that have been done looking at the effects of implementing PALS or PBIS. In general, in elementary schools that implement PBIS at Fidelity, we get a 20 to 60% reduction in problem behavior. So I want you to think about that. A 20 to 60% reduction in the likelihood that students engage in problem behavior. There's also a statistically significant increase in the likelihood that students interact more positively with each other and with adults. Students demonstrate what Catherine Bradshaw calls improved emotional regulation, and in elementary schools implementing PBIS for 3 years, if they also had a solid academic program, so if they had a good curriculum and effective instruction, implementing PBS resulted in an increase in the academic outcomes, not just for the high functioning students, but especially important, the lowest functioning students. There was a decrease in the achievement gap between the disadvantaged students or the students who came from more challenged backgrounds and students who came from more privileged backgrounds. We also found that students identified the school as a safer environment. Remember that whole idea, predictable, consistent, positive, and safe. And safe is always something that the students identify themselves. For those of you who are administrators and organizers, part of what we've also seen is implementing PBIS with Fidelity results in more effective schools. The school operates more efficiently. There's lower level of staff turnover. And the thing that I really enjoy, we've done 3 different studies demonstrating that teachers identify themselves as being more successful. The efficacy of teachers is improved when they're implementing PBIS. Now, most of this research has been done in the US, but recently there have been excellent studies that were done looking at programs in Norway. And those studies demonstrated both that the PALS program could be implemented well, not always done perfectly, but well, and with an effect on both the academic and social benefits for students. So if we do this well, we see change. We also saw one study that said a study that was much more systematically organized, a very rigorous study comparing PALS in Norway with traditional interventions. They found that implementing PALS changed the rate of student problem behavior and improved what they call the classroom learning environment. A more recent study, which was done in Belgium by a doctoral student, Caroline Deltour, showed that PALS could be implemented in Belgian schools, and she was particularly interested in what were the variables that were necessary to adjust. And what she found were that there were three big things that made a big difference. One, PALS will work in a school really only when you have administrator support. The principal says, these are outcomes I value, these are practices I will support, and these are systems that we're going to put in place. So the leadership in your school makes a huge difference. Having the time and resources to work not just by yourself, but as a school team also makes a huge difference. And finally, being able to have the professional development. So the work of saying, how do we actually go about teaching expectations? How do we build instructional corrective systems? And having the coaching from school psychologists, counselors, and social workers who are able to assist as teams put things in place. So let me stop there just a little bit and say, often, if I were with you, we'd have a period where I'd say, what are some of the questions you're coming up with? And a few of the questions that I often get are, how can we be sure that this will work in our school or in our community or in our country? And my answer is always this: come back to the idea that PALS is a framework. It incorporates these core features: expectations, acknowledgements, corrections, the multi-tiered strategy, the prevention approach. But the way that it gets implemented builds on what you already do well and what your social context is. So different schools will have different behavioral expectations. Different schools will use different strategies. One Native American a school in the United States that primarily supported students that came from the indigenous Native American community, we identified behavioral expectations that were consistent with their culture. When the teachers taught the behavioral expectations, they brought elders from that community. It was a way that worked perfectly for them. It would not have worked in Chicago, New York, LA, or Washington, DC, but it worked for them. So be clear about the core features, use what you already do well, and build in a way that fits your local community. How do we actually get buy-in? I mean, one of the things, if you wanted to do PALS, one of the problems you've got is it's not just what you do, you've got to get the whole faculty engaged in making this happen. And that can be tough. It can be tough to convince people to once again gear up and do something collaboratively. Here's what I would argue, and I've done this a lot. Part of what I've learned is don't walk in and say, we went to a workshop, we want to adopt PALS. Start by saying, are we happy with the way the kids are behaving right now? If we're not, what's the smallest thing we can do that will make our school a more effective learning environment? The goal is to make the school a more effective learning environment. So let's agree to 4 things. 1, let's agree that we will keep doing what already works. We're not going to stop doing the things that work well. 2nd, let's only adopt things that have been demonstrated in research ways to make a difference. Let's not do things we just think up. Let's do things that actually work. 3rd, let's do the smallest change that'll make the biggest benefit for students. Let's not overwhelm ourselves by trying to do everything all at once. Smallest change that will make the biggest difference for students. And let's keep doing that over and over a period of time to build the social culture we want. And then one of the big ones, and this again is for those of you who are administrators, is we've learned never add something new to a staff in a school unless you identify what you're going to stop doing to create the time and resources. People don't typically already have more minutes to add. So we need to be really clear. We're going to do less of this and we're going to use that time to actually implement. So when we do that well, that's how we then say, if we do that, how many people agree that if you were to take a vote in your school, how many people agree that we want to make improving the social culture and the behavior of students one of our top 3 goals for the next 2 years? In schools in the United States implementing PALS, 80% agree to that. When you get that level of agreement, then you can implement things and work. Another question we often get is, how do we actually sort of really incorporate and embed families? In many parts of the world, there's less than good collaboration and integration between families and schools. It's a sadness. As I said before, our experience is that you do this better than we do. But part of what we've learned is you've got to reach out and make this work for families. We've been especially interested in the work of Tom DeShawn. And Tom DeShawn's work with family checkup and positive family support is something that you have been implementing in Sweden for over a decade. And you've been doing it very well. We see in what Tom is doing with families a nice marriage with what we've been doing in schools. Multi-tiered system. There's strategies that he uses with all families. There's strategies that he adds for families who are in more difficulty. And then there are real programs, individualized, to support families that need the most intense support. The work that Tom has done is a nice collaboration. It fits with the multiple tiers of PBS, the multiple tiers of family support. Part of what we've learned is if we do this well, we really can do a much better job of having families feel as if the school is part of what they're doing. We include them, not just inform them. And one way we do that is we take time as a faculty in a school to be really clear to the families about how they can help to support both the academic and the social success of their son or daughter. So do this for me right now. I mean, think about if you were working with the families in your schools, what are 2 or 3 things that you would tell families that they can do to maximize the benefit of children? If you were to say, I want all the families in our schools to be clear about how we do this, how would you do that? What would be the real key? And if we had time, we could walk through and take a look at what your thoughts are and how it fits. When I've done this with schools in the US, the things that we keep coming up with, I mean, keep it simple. Some families are really pressed. I mean, don't say, give us lots of money or spend 10 hours a week volunteering at school. Make it something that's simple. Here's what we want. I want, as a family member, every day when your child comes home from school, ask them how the school day went. Make it clear that what happens at school is important. Second, create a time and place where they can do their homework, where they can practice. Don't do their homework for them, but make it a rhythmic event. This is the time of day, this is where you do it, and just make it something that becomes part of the home rhythm. And the other part, third big thing, communicate with the school. Let us know when something happens that is different or a challenge. If a pet dies or if there's a shift in the family, let us know, because in many times we can be helpful. And that's going to be important for us, understanding how to do good support. we've worked hard in the US in trying to align and integrate family engagement with PBIS, and work that Lucille Eber and Susan Barrett and Mark Wiest, who's at the University of South Carolina, they have given us excellent guidance. And those of you who are really interested in building the family pieces in, part of what I would encourage you to do is to look at these two manuals, which you can download, you can get for free at pbis.org, and look at ways in which you can make this something that will actually be a key part of what you're actually doing. All right, I'm going to do one or two more messages and then hopefully move into discussion and comment. But I want you to get a couple of more big ideas. One of the things that I said early on is that we use data within PALS, and not data that is researchy data, but data that is used to inform decisions. And the two things that are really important is asking the question, are we really implementing PALS well? And is it benefiting students? So you should be able to have data that allows you to keep track of if you're doing this on a regular basis, on whether students are knowledgeable and able to build the social competence that they're doing. Now, we have learned that information is among the best ways to empower faculty to adjust PBIS or PALS to fit their local context. So one of the things that I would encourage you to do is, if you're going to get ready to do this, at least twice a year, I would encourage you to use what in Sweden is called checklist A, which is a checklist of those core features. And typically what happens is the team in a school says, are we doing those things? But you don't just use it as a test or as an assessment. You use it as a way to say, if these are the things we're doing well, let's celebrate always what we do well and identify, remember, the smallest additional change that we can see that we think would have the biggest value for students. If you use checklist A as a way of saying, are we doing PALS? Then when you have a faculty meeting, actually show people, this is what we're doing well, this is what we're not doing well. We measure if we're actually implementing what we said we would do. In the US, we have another tool that we use. It's called the Tiered Fidelity Inventory. And our colleagues in Norway and in Belgium are translating this. If this was something that you wanted to look at and also use, you're welcome to do this. It's something that we've found helpful. And in fact, in the US, we have literally thousands of schools that are measuring if they're implementing. These are the states in the United States. The bar is the number of schools implementing PBIS. So if you look at California, California is a state with about 10,000 schools. About a third of those schools are currently implementing PBIS. And they not only are implementing, but the important thing is they are measuring if they're being successful. So last year, about 16,000 schools measured if they were doing PBIS at Fidelity. 11,000 of them actually met the criterion of saying, we're doing this well enough that we would expect to see change in students. So big ideas, the combining of values and science, the emphasis on core values that will get us where we really want to be moving forward. If you're able to do that well, you're going to start by building consensus with your faculty. You're going to incorporate the perspectives and the input, both of students and of the families. And you're going to be focusing on building something that is a key element to really going forward. If we do this well, here's what I've learned. We're able to take values, combine it with instructional and behavioral science, and with the technology necessary to implement well. Remember that issue around systems. Putting those together is a way where you're actually able to build this framework that will work to improve both the social and the academic benefits for kids. PALS is both an effective approach. The practices and the systems work. It's efficient in the sense that normal teachers can do this. Over 30,000 schools in the United States are actually actively implementing PBIS right now. And about half of them are actually doing it at the level of fidelity where they're getting change. The other thing that is important to us is when we do PBIS well, when we do PALS well, what we see is a benefit for all students, and especially a benefit for those students with the most need, the students who have the strongest concern related to their social success. We see students interacting well together. We see students interacting consistently with adults in the building in ways that are more respectful and more responsible. And when that is done consistently over time, part of what we see is not just the development of effective self-regulation and social and emotional competence of students, but we also see improvement in academic outcomes. So thank you for letting me take the time to walk through some of the basic elements with respect to PBIS. So Patrick, can you help me in
Yes.
Wisdom?
Yes, we have received a couple of questions here, and I'll take them in order as they came in, because I don't know how much time we will have and how much you need to tell us response to each question. I'm starting with this one. Shouldn't this be on the shouldn't this be on the principals and the administrators, not to mention the local politicians, since they are the ones who decide, read, micromanage our classrooms and daily work? I mean, how do I model respect to my students when I'm not respected and trusted by those further up in the food chain? Don't get me wrong. I know how respect works, only it's yet to be seen directed towards teachers.
I think that is a brilliant question. And it's right at the heart. The key, the thing that I love most about that question is it typically is one that I get from students, where the students say, you're telling me to be respectful, but I'm not respected from the teachers that I work with. And so I think the point that I love about that question is respect. Respect means treating other people in a way in which you acknowledge that your behavior affects everybody else around you. Being respectful means you're treating people with dignity, with integrity. And I completely agree that it starts by us being respectful with each other. It absolutely needs to be something where we're talking about we being respected from the people above. And it also comes down to teaching students that they not only should expect to be respected, but they should treat each other with dignity and respect. All right, so I completely agree with the person who wrote the question in terms of saying, where does this start? And that's why in the US, we don't do PALS. as being a classroom program. We do PALS as being the whole school. And we don't implement unless the leadership of the school, the politicians, the administrators agree that these are core values that they're going to embrace. And we also, as part of the training, we take time to talk about what that is going to mean. A major thing that we also find is that when we build a rhythm in which the data with respect to PALS and to student outcomes are shared with all in the school system on a regular basis, that sharing of information draws people in to the decision-making process. And when you're part of the decision-making, that's part of being treated with respect. So the point is very well taken. And one of the things that we teach, I mean, as a university professor, I train teachers. And part of what we train our teachers to do is we say, listen, you first and foremost must do your job brilliantly. Those who look up to you, you must make everyone who looks up to you more competent and effective than they would otherwise be. But you haven't really done your job unless you are also clear about those above you in the hierarchy, about what you need from them to be successful and effective. If all of us operate in our systems where we do our job brilliantly, we help everyone below us be more successful than they would otherwise be, and we hold those above us to be accountable, we will get systems that work more effectively. Come back to the message I gave you earlier on. Schools that implement PALS have teachers who are more likely to identify themselves as being effective, teachers who are less likely to turn over, and schools that are identified as being more organizationally effective.
Okay, thank you. There is another question, and you have already mentioned this. Maybe it was asked before, but maybe you have something to add. Do you in any way find it problematic to transfer a model or practice from one country school system to a different country school system regarding to what we in Sweden refer to as evidence?
There's two parts to that question. The research, do we think the research generalizes? And the answer is the student behavior and the student teacher behavior research that we've done translates very well. The systems pieces, how do you do training and coaching and what are the organizational structures, have been different, in part because in the United States, the control for schools is really at the school district level. So we have a federal government, a state government, a school district, and then the school building. That's very different than the way things are organized in New Zealand or Australia or Belgium or Catalan, and certainly different than what we found in Norway. I don't know enough about how the systems are organized in Sweden, but I would say the research, to what extent does the research apply? The outcomes with respect to benefits for students, I think, would apply very directly. The outcomes with respect to the organizational systems, I think, would need to be replicated. That's why we've been so excited by the work that's being done in Belgium and Norway.
Okay, thank you. Can you say something about the importance of continuously practicing expected behavior? Our experience is that it's easier and more natural with the younger children.
So there's two parts to that. One is the teaching part and one is the practicing part. The younger children are looking to adults for guidance and suggestions. The thing that has been so exciting for us is in grades kindergarten 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What we find is the students are really very very comfortable learning the behavioral expectations, practicing the expectations on a regular basis, coming back, doing activities or doing sessions with the kids monthly has worked very, very well. When you get to the older grades, they all believe that they already know it all. So I love in grades 6, 7, 8, one of the things that I would do regularly with schools that just began using PALS, I would do a survey of the students. And I would say, now that you've been taught the behavioral expectations, is this a good idea? Is this something that we should do regularly? And a common variation on the feedback that I would get from the students is they would say, I personally, as a totally knowledgeable and skilled 7th grader, did not need this training. But I have to tell you, the behavior of my peers is atrocious. And it is really wonderful that you all are providing training for all of them. So I love that. It fits the developmental level. But what it really does is it gives you this sense of building a social community at grades 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 is not something you do to the students, you do it with the students. And when they are included in the process, when they're included in selecting what the expectations are, the language that you use, you don't do the teaching the same way. In grades 9, 10, 11, 12, we often have the students leading some of the more experienced students leading the training of younger, newer students coming into our, what we call high school. So the way that it's done needs to fit the developmental level of the students. Here's what we find. What we find is that many of the students already have a lot of the skills, but by articulating those skills in a clear manner, it makes it so that all of the students are aware. Come back to that slide that I gave about common language, common vision, common experience. When you give students a common experience, they not only know that they know that everyone else knows. That is a critical variable for building a social culture. So yes, you do it differently with younger students. Yes, the smaller they are, the more often you have to repeat it, but find the way to do it that fits the local context. An example, in Los Angeles, we were working with schools that were heavily influenced by gang behavior. And the gangs in Los Angeles had tarnished the word respect. Respect was used in a way that was almost a gang tagged manner. So the families and the students said, no, we don't want to use respect. We want to use a different word. And so they came up with other words with respect to being courteous, being kind, being thoughtful, being helpful of others. They came up with the words and the language that fit their community. And once they had come up with it, it was much easier to embed it into the fabric of those schools.
Thank you. We have another question. Thank you, Rob, for a very interesting talk. I would love some more information and examples regarding the stop, walk, talk of removing social awards for problem behavior. Is it correct to say that there are conflicting motivations for behavior, that some problematic behaviors are more strongly acknowledged by peer social awards than an alternative, more appropriately behavior by adult social awards? How do you in practice work with this then in the US?
Excellent question. So a major goal in the way of building a positive social culture is teaching the students how to deal with inappropriate behavior from their peers. The Stop, Walk, Talk program is one strategy that we've used primarily in elementary and middle schools. And what we do is, the very first thing we do is we teach students the concept of being respectful. And when we teach being respectful, we don't just teach how to do it the right way. We also say, well, what is not being respectful? So what is being respectful? What is not being respectful? The idea then is, if someone behaves in a way, if they do name calling, if they are threatening, if they are physically pushing or shoving, if people are doing things that violate the social norms, what do you do? And what we try and do is we try and teach the students a routine that will remove the social rewards that so often maintain those aggressive behaviors from peers. And the social rewards come not just from the student who is receiving the problem behavior, but from bystanders who are watching. So the stop in elementary schools, part of what we've learned is anytime somebody is behaving in a way that's not respectful, you say stop. And you use a signal. Some do this, some do that. They do different things. But the message is, give your peer a very clear signal that this is not okay. Walk away and talk to an adult. So part of what we're doing is we are withdrawing the social rewards for inappropriate behavior. A colleague named Scott Ross did a study of the Stop, Walk, Talk program on playgrounds in elementary schools in the United States. And what he did is he identified schools that had a very high rate of bullying and aggression on the playground. And he went into the schools. We taught basic school-wide expectations: be respectful, be responsible, be safe. But when we taught being respectful, we used examples of what was not respectful as being things that students saw regularly on the playground. This is not being respectful. This is being respectful. This is not being respectful. So we taught the discrimination. Second, we taught all the students to use a simple signal. If someone is not respectful, you say stop and you walk away. All right. We monitored with direct observation. We had graduate students watching on the playground, and we watched the effect that had. There was a 72% reduction in bullying behavior over a 3-week period after the students had been taught to use the stop, walk, talk. The critical variable was that the students who were engaging in inappropriate behavior, the playground supervisor would also prompt them in appropriate ways to get peer attention. So it wasn't that we said you get no peer attention. We said you don't get peer attention for behaving badly. You do get peer attention for behaving appropriately. When they knew the appropriate way to get peer attention, we saw shifts in behavior over time. And that the Stop Walk Talk program is also available for free. You can download off of pbis.org. But as I said before, you in Sweden actually have some elegant strategies that are very consistent with that message that you already use. So I would encourage you to start with what is indigenous and build from there. But this has been a tier 2 intervention that has worked well for us.
Thank you, Rob. There is another question related to transferring the model from one country to another. Are there any particular experiences from implementing in other countries that can be generalized? I guess one experience is about being flexible, but are there any concrete advice to be mentioned?
Yes, there's lots of concrete advice. I mean, so much so. One of the messages I want to give is I don't want to make this sound too simple. We typically do full workshops on each one of the core features and the strategies. So in terms of implementing in another culture, the first thing that I would say, always start with values. So the first thing that I would do with a school that was considering PALS would be to say, are we comfortable with the behavior of the students? If we're not, what are the core things that we want all students to embrace? If we're going to do that, if that is really the goal, have a way of measuring if you're doing PALS and if it makes a difference. If you don't have a way of measuring, it just becomes mythology. So use checklist A, use the data that you have from your students on the social and academic outcomes. The next thing I would say is expect not just to get an initial training, but also to get coaching from a school psychologist, counselor, social worker, or behavior specialist who is part of or comes to your school to help do the coaching to get it right when you first get started. So start with a foundation, focus on having the data, get the professional development, not just a one-time professional development, but professional development with the coaching that allows you to adapt and do it well. Patrick, you're muted.
I noticed this. Thank you. The time is running out and the questions have also been running out. So I would actually like to thank you for staying up all night, because it must be very late by you. It's like way past midnight.
It's 2:30 in the morning.
2:30 in the morning. Thank you so much. We really appreciate that you are here for us today and that you've been doing such a wonderful talk. So
I appreciate the opportunity. And if there are more questions, I would encourage people to send me emails or feel free to push forward. I think the fact that you all are looking at moving forward with this agenda is very exciting. And we want to provide all of the support and encouragement and assistance that we can. So feel free, send me things in English rather than Swedish, but I'd be happy to respond. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and sleep well now. Thank you. Thank you. Okej, vi kommer nu att ha 15 minuters paus. Vi kommer att ses igen för att titta på Martin Karlbergs föreläsning klockan 10:15. Så gå och gör vad ni behöver. Be en sträcka, hämta kaffe eller vad det är. Så ses vi om 15 minuter. Tack så mycket.